Hey guys, how's it going? I'm the Duke of Italy, your favorite lo-fi music YouTuber, and welcome to part 2, the conclusion, the thrilling conclusion of the review for ISIS's Discography, one of my favorite bands maybe ever. I talk about them probably every single day, not even kidding, like when I'm with my band, when I'm with my friends, when I'm with my girlfriend, doesn't matter who. I'm talking about ISIS because they're simply just I can't stop. For those of you who missed the first video, or if you need a recap, ISIS is a post-metal, sludge metal band from the United States, from Boston, I believe, and throughout their storied and eclectic career, they ranged, at least what I talked about last time, they started with a very sludgy metalcore style sound that drifted into truly a weird, cool blend of post-metal, metalcore, and sludge metal all in one, and then that went into a totally new direction, being one of the bands known for doing post-metal, and that's what they began with. And they started off a little rocky with very post-rock style leanings, very aggressive sound, very low fidelity, and they originally worked with them, and then it kind of drifted away from that, and then they reached Oceanic, where the concept truly came to fruition. The songwriting blossomed, and they ended up with a astounding album being Oceanic. And today, can't really beat around the bush because we're starting with the album following Oceanic, arguably their best project, quite possibly their best project. This is Panopticon. Now, you're all probably wondering how the heck could anything live up to Oceanic, because that was so grand, so doomy, so impressive. How could you ever live up to that? And they kind of do. So I spoke a little bit last time about the concept of the album Celestial, and how it was about sort of privacy, and how it was kind of a half-baked concept. And here on Panopticon, you get an interesting mix of a different style of tension in lyrics that do match it a lot more, with very simple, very sparse deliveries, which will change on future albums, but it's kind of one of the last times that this sparse, grand, yet roaring delivery from Aaron happens. And this all begins on one of the most popular ISIS tracks, So Did We, and it kicks off with a really cool syncopated beat. ISIS is kind of known for these more syncopated beats, oddly enough, something that you could put in a more pop-oriented context with a band like Deftones, where you have a rhythm section that is propelled forward by this drummer that just keeps a very consistent momentum, but he just syncopates it, so it adds a little bit of extra tension. And this track starts tense with some really thick bass playing and a ton of distortion. And it quickly gives way to some less distorted melodic sections. And they're incredible. They feel very floaty and aquatic. First time I ever listened to this album, I was surprised that this and Oceanic weren't both ocean themed, because this is a very floaty, very gorgeous sound. It's also got one of my favorite bass tones of all time. The way he hits it, especially with the delay pedal that is used sparingly, tastefully, it sounds fantastic. It's when he hits the higher notes. It's clear he like picks it like super hard, but it's at a lower register. He probably lowers the high stat on his amplifier, and the way it just clangs and it just rings out in this really phenomenal way. There's no way anything else in the world that percussive can sound that good. This song is gorgeous. It's clear and pristine. And while you're floating and just soaking up all this atmosphere, you get the heavy sludge metal part that is just driving incredibly. It's such an interesting context here, because it feels more like shoegaze than sludge metal. The post-rock lift isn't this super driving, intense thing that you'd normally get. The tag of post-metal here is utterly justified with its shattering of preconceived notions of the genre, where it has to have a build into a tense release that gets louder and louder. This is an album here that you can tell just from this song that it will have huge drops, huge ascensions. It goes every which way possible. The textures are phenomenal, and you get this all from one song. You are immersed entirely in this, and it is amazing. And this goes into the next track, Backlit, which is where you get the concept of the album more in fruition, because it's got the lyrics are done in this really nice way. It's like really blatant, simple questions, and they are, of course, roaring. This is an insanely loud, gorgeous thing. Backlit is such an underrated song. It's one of my favorite ISIS songs, one of my favorite metal songs, one of my favorite post-metal songs ever, simply ever. And it begins the concept of this album with a heavenly and untouchable build. There's no band that could ever do it like this, except for maybe Neurosis. Not for like a generic pick there, but I've heard other atmospheric sludge metal bands, and I've heard other post-metal bands, and they can't do it. You get various bass tones and melodic playing. That bass tone I talked about before is awesome. It has this melody that changes chords for every couple bars. And it's so great where the guitar will loop the same thing over top as a slow, somewhat melodic melody. And it sounds just fantastic. It's so gorgeous. And you feel like you're floating. And it goes into this really intense climax with the slightly harsh voice of Aaron doing a singing part here. That sounds amazing. And it builds up again, and it hits again in a much shorter context. And right when you think it's going to hit the same way, it's these giant down-picked riffs as he's turning on the harsh vocals, and it's these really in-your-face questions of like, are you watching? Which is not to be bearing witness or something, but it's more like, are you impeding on my personal life? But the sludge metal fake out instead of the second post-metal climax is paranoid and anguished, and it pulls back for the least distorted part of the track, which you get this more post-rock leaning sort of outro segment where it goes through all these winding melodies, and they sound just pristine yet so much more tense, which is, it kind of calls back to Weight from Oceanic, where the least distorted parts could hide the most tension, which you'd think there'd be a release with all this stuff, but it's so interesting having the more unexpected parts happen. And this goes into one of the most popular tracks off the album, In Fiction. It has the most somber intro. It's very sour feeling, and it's got a guitar tone that is filled with perfect chorus. It's a highly meditative part of the album, and the album's signature slightly off-kilter drum grooves that usher the whole thing forward. It is an utterly hopeless track until the distortion hits, which goes into a much groovier climax than Isis is typically known for. And the whole track is led out with this really somber bass line. It's really a track that evokes a lot of what Oceanic was going for, but it kind of expands on it in a different direction. It's a more melodic bass part, yet a much more groovy section overall, and yet it remains one of the most intense Isis tracks to date. And this goes into another banger, Wills Dissolve. The tension is continued with a very ominous bass part, and there aren't any drums for quite a while. It really takes its time, which Isis, if I haven't made that clear by now, they know how to take their time, and they know how to take their time for the perfect amount of time. You know, they never take too much time, at least for someone like me. I'm sure if you aren't used to post-metal or Isis or metal in general, or any kind of post-rock adjacent genre or anything experimental necessarily, this might be a little long-winded for you, but for me, it is just breathtaking. And when the drums come in, they come in syncopated against the rhythm section, sort of forming a contrasting set of rhythms. The tones here are mixed perfectly. They're blended in the most beautiful way. The same melody is kept but changing slightly and added on more distortion slowly. It's maybe the most jam band adjacent track they've done. It definitely has a jammier, more constructive feel to it, except the crushing release has a very joyless feeling. And then you get kind of a note that hasn't been hit since Mosquito Control. You get sort of a sludge metal fake breakdown, and it sounds awesome. It has just amazing songwriting here. It's on full display. And this goes into Syndic Calls. It is utterly hypnotic through its delay effects and minimalist guitars, sort of an ambient tone to the whole thing. It's maybe got the best sort of instant release on the record. It very quickly gets into the action. And the recurring theme of the Panopticon really helps with the tension. It's highly meditative and even sad. Not an explosive track by any means, but more of a slow, doomy burn. It sounds incredible. I should probably mention at some point on this album, the title Panopticon. A Panopticon is a design for a prison concept where it would be a circular prison with a single tower in the middle that you could not see the person inside the tower at any point. And this person could see any single one of the prisoners. So it's this idea of you might be watched at any time, but you don't know it. And this works perfectly with the album concept, and also even the album cover, where it's like this aerial shot of who knows where. It's sort of this interesting idea about modern privacy and if technology is invading that too much, and it has got aged literally perfectly. I hate to say it, it's aged too well. And this takes us into Altered Course, which has a Justin Chancellor feature, the bassist of Tool, and he fits amazingly. You get a stacked sound here. And Justin Chancellor, he's a wizard on the bass. He's actually probably the reason I started taking bass a little bit more seriously. Flea made me want to play the bass. Justin Chancellor made me want to play the bass well. No offense to Flea. I love Red Hot Chili Peppers. I love the guy. But Justin Chancellor, his work with Tool is phenomenal. But this track sounds amazing. It is a gorgeous, almost ambient shoegazy guitar. And it is just an instrumental, and yet it manages to be one of the most teeth-gritting, crunchiest, heaviest tracks here. It will tear you apart, but it is also the most ambient track here. It's got a serious length to it. I'm probably doing it a disservice speaking about it so little, but you just soak into it and you just grit your teeth, and it's a real slow burn, but it's awesome. And overall, you are just melting along with it. This leads us into the final track, Grinning Mouths. It is the opposite of Altered Course. It feels like an ascension. You have these intense, triumphant melodies that lift it all out of the dark. It's also maybe the sludgiest track here. It's almost like Pissed Off. These really slow, shifting chords provide so much room for the other instruments, and the guitars screech over the entire mix. But it's not in a way that's overshadowing anything, and it's still utterly hopeless despite how pretty it all is. And it's truly ultimate. It has an amazing feeling to it. It is an incredible track. Now, some final thoughts on this album before I give it a rating. This is an album that needs insanely loud volume. You will be satisfied with this thing at a lower volume. You'll still think it sounds pretty, almost like some dream pop or something. But to truly grasp the insane volume dynamics and the crushing, perfect distortion, you definitely need loud volume. I listened to this thing in my car. There was literally a time I was listening to this thing in my car, and I was driving off to Guitar Center to pick up some part or something like that, and I decided, you know what? I'm going to see where all the fast food restaurants are nearby just so I could drive around a parking lot and see what was good. This thing is conceptually sound, perfect production. This thing sounds gorgeous. It's maybe one of the best records I've ever heard sound-wise. Yeah, I'm feeling a Based and Red Pilled on this thing. There were arguably some tracks that aren't as good as the rest. I mean, Backlit is just one of the best things I've ever heard, and I mean, a couple of them just aren't backlit really, and that's the only complaint. There's not a single song on here that isn't fantastic, and it's so amazing of an album. And the next release we're talking about is one that a lot of you might have heard before, Panopticon. This is a type of release I actually have not yet talked about on this channel in significant length, aside from maybe a chart review, which I believe I did for the albums that sound like Spiderland. Go check that one out if you haven't already. But we're covering In the Fish Tank, specifically number 14. This is ISIS's collab with Aerogram. This is just a quick 3 songs that the two bands collaborate on. It's an EP, pretty short stuff. It's on Spotify, thankfully, as most of these series don't exist anywhere except for like YouTube and like a really terrible low fidelity. But this is actually some people's favorite ISIS release. I don't really get why, but it's still pretty cool. There's nothing really earth-shattering here, but I feel like these songs are worth talking about. The first one is Low Tide, which some people say is the best song they've ever heard. Maybe you'll like it a little more than I did. It's got a little bit more of a melodic take on what ISIS normally does. And the biggest feature you get from Aerogram on this whole album, actually, is the vocalist on this release. You don't really get Aaron's vocals, but this guy sounds actually really great. He's got a really cool melancholic style of singing. It works super well. It's a very dreamy sound overall, not as crushing nearly as any other ISIS release. It's more of a post-rock take on what ISIS normally does, and it sounds awesome. And the later 4 minutes of this track have these much heavier electronic sections that sound pretty neat, to be completely honest, and I feel like that's more of an Aerogram contribution, but the song does get more compressed and dreamy. It sounds insane as it ends. It's a very interesting way of progressing. I think it's a very solid song. And this goes into the track Delisle, I believe, or if I would pronounce it how I think it's pronounced, it's Delisle, but I believe it's not English, so I think it's Delisle. I could be looking like an idiot right now. But it's a cool track. It's really thick sludge. It reminds me a lot of earlier Isis. And it's super dissonant and weird. It's super cool, honestly, even though it sounds a little weird. It's got these really intense riffs. And it's just churning and churning until you reach this really noisy section right in the middle of the track. And even though it just has 2 riffs, it feels a lot like Tool for some reason. It's got that surging quality to it. It feels intense. And finally is the track Stolen, which has this distant tribal drumming. It sounds really cool. It feels less like Godflesh, which I know Isis is influenced by. It feels a lot more like Tool. Think Triad from Lateralis. And with its lax moments here, it actually feels a lot like hints of Black Gaze here and there. And it turns super ambient, which is really beautiful. Now, I don't know Aerogram that well, so I have no idea how much they actually contributed to this album. It could have been just the vocalist, but I highly doubt that. I'm just saying that to play devil's advocate, really. I'm sure they added the electronic elements as much as Isis has those. They're more subtle on Isis's end, but you get a really cool collaboration here. I think this is definitely worth a listen for everybody. There's nothing really earth-shattering, but for a studio session and for something I think they constructed in not that long, it's really, really excellent. It's a come to Brazil. I can't even lie. And then we get another banger of an album. This is In the Absence of Truth. This begins with the track Wrists of Kings. And it starts with some really cool resonant electronics, which is something I should mention about this album just from the get-go. You feel a lot more of the electronics. Isis has always had electronics since, I want to say Oceanic, maybe even earlier, probably Celestial to be completely honest, and they've always been very subtle or clear on the interludes, but here and on this album and going forward, you feel them a lot more clearly. And this track has some huge Danny Carey-esque tom hits, such as Ticks and Leeches. I've been listening to a lot of Tool recently. It's got a burning, intense build. It is a hell of a way to start off an album, or even a track. It's followed by a slightly somber groove with some of Aaron's best singing, and that is something also with these last albums from Isis. Aaron's singing is so much more melodic and so much more clear and very, very good. There's also a really nice developed guitar melody here. It's definitely a lot more melodic. It's not as slow moving and winding. It's certainly more subdued in volume, but you feel the sludginess underneath before the hard turn into just crushing territory in the last minute, which leads us to a track with one of my favorite titles, Not in Rivers But in Drops. It begins vast and chuggy, which you feel the Tool and the Deftones influences, which is funny because the bands were probably all influencing each other around the same time. This is something you'll hear me mention a lot. Chino Marino and all the members of Isis have a band called Palms, P-A-L-M-S, and I mean, it's not an amazing band to me, but I think they clearly all influenced each other enough to gain a real relationship. Anywho, some really explosive drums under this track. It's still really hypnotic, but it's a lot more explosive and as well as direct. It's very progressive at the same time. You got a lot more interesting, more direct elements going on. You get some really amazing chuggier and groovier sections, kind of harkening back to the band's very first release. And the really slow come down at the end actually feels great. The next track is Dulcinea, which I would say is very similar to the previous track, except the energy is a bit more explosive. It builds further. It builds for a total of 3 minutes, and then it's just pounding away. Just some insane drumming here, just a surging feeling. It is one of the most explosive tracks Isis has ever made. It's a lot more to the point than their stuff. It's almost like they're parodying themselves to an extent, but even parodying themselves, it's insane. You get some really bright, crystalline guitars. They're almost experimenting with a pedal board beyond what I would have known them for, and most people could have predicted them for. And the crystalline textures really mellow out for a more melodic, typical sound. And the whole album so far has this really sad, mournful tone to it. It sounds incredible. And you have this huge burning melodic lead that ends up with just this phenomenal track, and I love how consistent it is. It's just rolling through the whole thing. Next track is Over Root and Thorn. Huge, gorgeous ambient build. It turns into a really spacey, gorgeous instrumental. It's like post-rock ambient, and it's floaty, but most importantly, it's dark. And the contrast between the light and the dark and the soft and the heavy is real. It is probably one of Isis's most intricately composed instrumentals, and the vibrant bass tone fills everything perfectly. And if the Tool comparisons aren't enough, at around 7 minutes, you actually get a topless sound, which has a super dark and very textured addition to the composition. And it concludes it perfectly. And next we reach the track 1000 Shards. It's got a super dense mix of gorgeous delayed guitars, clanging bass, and spacious drums. And it's got these really cool lyrics that actually really flesh out the concept of the album. They're all about perception in a way, which I think is really cool. They're excellently placed. That is probably about time for me to mention the album's concept. It's confusing. It is intentionally meant to be very complex and interpretive, which what's better to interpret than themes of perception? To be completely honest, there is something on this album I don't like, and it's on this very track. It's the vocal effects. They sound a bit silly. If you guys like them, then you like them, and good for you. All the power to you. I'm glad you could like everything that Isis has to offer. This is the one thing I don't really like, but you get this really immense, punchy guitar line. Kind of makes me forget the vocals ever happened, and it is just one note. Sort of, we got post beat down hardcore. All jokes aside, it's awesome. And the ending is just Kino. It's one of the highlights of the album. And then we get an interlude, all out of time, all into space. It's pretty standard Isis interlude. It's pretty spacey, pretty good way to chill. Certainly the weakest track on the album, and following the vocal effects on that last one, you know, it's not a couple good trends, but Isis has just so much power here that it's really hard to make this sound like anything that matters, because it barely does. This ends in the track Holy Tears. It's got a really grounded metal sound for a huge start to the track. And it's interesting because it's the closest thing we've had to an actual proper chorus to a song that Isis has ever had, and it sounds great. And there's a keyboard solo. Who would have thought? Well, I'm exaggerating, but you get some really cool keys. And the bass part just moves it all forward. They're all working in tandem, so you know, solos on this thing are far and few between in the entire discography of Isis, but you know, it just keeps chugging forward, and it sounds incredible. And I have to try to pronounce this one. The next track is Ferguis e Barine. They reference a lot of very interesting things on this album, and I don't understand half of them. Doesn't take away from my enjoyment though. It's very conceptually sound. But it is just an instrumental, but it's not just an instrumental. It has a dark and hostile atmosphere. You've got these really percussive synths and this really intense electronic drum loop. And it's got this really calm acoustic fake out, which is so unique for the band before the distortion returns. And the tension and the electronics is overall a very chill track that it does not get that heavy. The only thing that's really distorted are some of the electronics here, but the tension is there. It's super hypnotic with an almost krautrock-esque instrumental. It is super nice, but it sounds sick, and this leads me into Garden of Light, my favorite track on the album, and a banger. And you can tell from the repetitive Isis-esque build and the little hits of Tool here and there, and the vibraphone, that this one's going to be a banger, and it is. It is very progressive, some almost Mastodon-esque riffage. It is just pounded like Isis knows exactly how to, because they do know exactly how to. It takes this really interesting responding riff and just isolates it and just starts jamming on it, and it is so heavy and it's one of the most aggressive parts of the whole discography, and it's astounding. The song is packed with so much. It is an easy discography highlight. It is like 6 songs all packed into one. It uses its 9 minutes incredibly wisely. It is one of the most action-packed, amazing songs ever. It is like Isis's own Hearts Alive, and it is utterly breathtaking. And some notes on this album before I give it a final rating. The Spotify release, so quiet. I don't know why, but the electronics that are added over this whole thing, it's more synths, a little bit of keyboard, a little bit of texture here and there. Amazing addition. It makes this album so much better than honestly what it could have been. Not that it isn't written incredibly well, because it's written fantastically. The more percussive, Tool-like tendencies, the little hits of groove here and there are so sick. But this is another Isis release that needs volume, and it's another Isis release that is based in Red Pill. It's a 9 out of 10. It's incredible. It's fantastic. You should buy a physical copy of different forms of media because it is so amazing and borderline essential. It's fantastic. Listen to it because you probably haven't. And with that, we get the final full-length release from Isis, Wavering Radiant, which begins with the track Hall of the Dead. It's interesting because you have a really cool blend of the more heavy sound they've been working with and the dreamy soundscapes all into one. It's not as separated as they had before, which even before they blended it pretty well, but here it is as intrinsically linked as possible. These tones, if they even separated them, I wouldn't even know how they worked. I gotta know their pedal setup. It's very melodic, playing on all fronts, and that is what this album has taken from the last one that is amped up further. It is a bit more progressive overall, and this is a pretty tight-knit song overall. It sounds great, and nothing I say even matters because there is a Hammond organ part, and if that doesn't make you want to listen to this right now, I don't know what to tell you. Of course, it's played fantastically, and Hammond organ is known as being a very progressive instrument, progressive rock basically, but it's very percussive. It hits normally very hard, but here the soundscape it makes is so unique and ambient. It's beautiful. There are other synths that provide the whole atmosphere, and it is just gorgeous. Borderline a jaw-dropping song with a blend of ambient, post-rock, little bit of progressive metal in there, post-metal, sludge metal, everything you could ever want in an Isis track, and it starts the album off beautifully. And next you get the track Ghost Key. So you get some really groovy drums here that adds a really, really nice element. And the synths and the bass both have this really cool delay effect that it's all layered together beautifully. It is an overall gripping soundscape. And once you reach about 2 minutes and 20 seconds, you start getting a call and response that is as tense and as gripping as possible. And the tremolo riff at about 3 minutes is mind-melting. And then around 6.5 minutes, you get a dreamscape that just comes in. Such a intense contrast. It's really genius. And the bass guitar groove is just perfect. And I do mean groove. It's groovin'. And the guitar tone is just crazy. And then you get Hand of the Host, which if you don't think they've ever had a banger, they have one now. And it is huge. One of the longest Isis tracks, almost 11 minutes in length. And it's got this really popping, syncopated snare sound, which, good stuff. And right after the intro, you get this super intense sludge metal just collision. And the effects on this track are insane. There's a tremolo effect that will melt your brain. Bass riff here sounds like $1,000,000. The way it arpeggiates it makes me feel like I'm floating off the floor. And it is surging a lot like Oceanic did and a lot like Panopticon did, and yet it's so much more melodic than that stuff. It's much more to the point. It feels so much more alive. It doesn't feel hopeless at all. It feels almost hopeful in a weird way. And Aaron's singing is gliding. The way he slides from note to note is just perfect. And you get a really tense conclusion. It's wound so tight that you think it's gonna snap, and then just like that, it goes into the track Wavering Radiant, which is just a simple 2-minute intermission, but it's composed pretty much entirely of synths that are as beautiful as they come. And I think it's kind of interesting that some albums will have interludes that are just constructed from the best textures you've ever heard. It's like they don't have a lot of purpose beyond that, but texturally they're perfect. Then you get the track Stone to Wake a Serpent, which is really gorgeous. It's a real classic Isis sound here. And it really feels like something like So Did We off of Panopticon, which if you're a fan of Isis and you're not me, then you'd be like, oh my gosh, it's the thing. I'm not soy like that, I like my own tracks. Of course I love So Did We as well. I'm not a contrarian. Just skip 20 minutes back in the video and you'll find that I like that song. And maybe, just maybe, this has the best Aaron vocal melody in the whole catalog. And there is another tabla sound here, which Isis really took the tool pill here, and it works really in their benefit. The sound effects work really well here. The tabla in conjunction with this adds a lot of momentum. And what makes this song is I call it a guitar solo, but if you like Key to the Gate by Burzum, I know it's black metal, and also Burzum, if that's not your speed, I'm not sorry. I'm talking about it anyway. But it's a similar vibe here with this burning just crashing melodic guitar line that sort of feels like a lone isolated guitar solo despite the surging electronics, feedback, distortion, guitar, syncopated drums underneath. It's a beautifully built, just crushing, just machine here. And the melodicism behind the guitar, it's intense. It's like, how can you even refrain from just chugging or pick sweeping or doing something heavy? And I think deathcore really needs to learn from this. And I know I said it before, and I'll probably say it again, but just ISIS's take on metalcore is astounding, and other metalcore bands really have no idea what they're doing. They really need to hear ISIS. Then you get the track 20 minutes / 40 years, which has insane guitar textures just buzzing by, and the melodies that are constructed into the song almost have a mournful tone to the whole thing. They're really somber and really interesting. And along with the rest of the album and the lyrics, it has a lot of room for interpretation, which makes this so complex. And the lead guitar is rather simple melodically, but texturally, it is just screeching away. And this leads us into the thrilling conclusion, Threshold of Transformation. It is a very ultimate feeling song. It's almost like ISIS knew this was going to be their last album. It is literally the threshold. In its roughly 10-minute runtime, it packs everything in. Different effects, high energy. It's sick. It's a very cathartic track as you got these crashing melodies just coming from everywhere. You know, it's just bombing you with the bass tone. It sounds so gorgeous, and the different guitars, it's amazing. It is such a nice track. It's really heavy, but it's got this beautiful send-off. And, you know, just interpret it for yourself. I hope you guys check this one out because, you know, I'm going to wrap this review up for this album here. You know, it's kind of like Tool in how much more progressive it is than Panopticon. You know, we're past that. We've covered In the Absence of Truth, and now we're here, and it's similarly building upon that. But you take these Tool elements and that they're seemingly influenced by, and you just blend them up, and they're so beautiful. There's not a single moment on this album that doesn't feel texturally manipulated in some way to sound fantastic. And this thing, gosh, you know what? It's the third best album in the whole catalog. It's based in Red Pill, but funnily enough, this isn't the last thing in ISIS's discography. ISIS makes it into the next decade, 2010, with a split with none other than the Melvins. Yes, ladies in mental gin, the Melvins. Famed sludge metal borderline originators, grunge fanatics, doom metal pioneers, experimental rock people, drone metal borderline inventors. Yes, the Melvins. And this release overall, the ISIS side is just bonus tracks off of Wavering Radiant, but they're worth a listen. So here, the Melvin side has alternative takes off tracks they've already made, which is Pig House and I'll Finish You Off. And I'm not the biggest Melvins fanatic. I don't know everything about their discography, so I've actually never heard these songs before. This split here, Pig House, is groovy, clearly well written, and it's overall fun, which I think Melvins knows how to do. And I'll Finish You Off just has the best riff ever. It's insane. It sounds sick. And it has organ. Gives it a little soul. It's really cool. Texturally, it's awesome. Riff-wise, it's awesome. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about the ISIS side, which are, of course, bonus tracks off of Wavering Radiant, but the fact that they're here, I should probably talk about them. Begins with Way Through Woven Branches, which has some really dope drumming. It sounds great, and it's got a crystal clear groove, which really highlights Aaron's vocals. And there aren't a lot of spaces to find this track, but on YouTube, where I was able to hear it, it's panned really weirdly, which I don't think is on the real thing. I'm just taking that with a grain of salt. If you guys try to listen to it, maybe a bonus track, special edition, deluxe edition of Wavering Radiant will have a better mixed version. But honestly, it is the poppiest ISIS track since their demo, which it's over 6 minutes, but it really relies on these intense grooves that lock you in. Borderline catchy stuff, oddly enough, fun stuff. And this goes into The Pliable Foe, which has even more clean singing. But it is a bit too upfront for my taste, personally. Overall, it's a really chill track. It's got some really gorgeous guitar, and the vocals blend with it perfectly. But to be completely honest, it is missing something. It's clear why it's a bonus track. Honestly, it's very plain songwriting for ISIS, which overall, the Melvin's ISIS split, it feels like leftovers, basically. It makes me kind of wonder why this release even really happened. I'm not going to give this like a number release, but I'm going to say it's good. So it's like a 7, I guess. You know, they're good songs. They're just a little poppy, little whatever in terms of the entire discography. You know, when you have a discography that is this stacked, can you really settle for second fiddle? I don't think there's another discography in the world that has this good studio releases, that has this consistent of a set of albums. Their only problem in their whole discography is a single EP, which is not even considered an official release. Meanwhile, Tool, another one of my favorite bands, has an album I would consider a dud, and one album I'd consider okay, being 10,000 Days because of a few rough songs. I'd say Death, the death metal band. They've got great albums, they've got good albums. Most bands, after they get old, get worse with time. Like Obituary, they get worse with time. Morbid Angel, they turned industrial eventually. Hell, one of my favorite black metal bands, Burzum. Varg got out of prison, made a few good albums, made a bad one, made some really lame dungeon synth. I cannot state enough how incredibly important it is that a band has released borderline nothing but bangers. They have quite possibly like 2 bad songs in their whole discography, and they're on the same release that they didn't even release officially after like the year it was made, and they've just hated that one EP. It's not even an album that has a bad song on it. Even their interludes, I've said before, the electronics of them are just gorgeous. Conceptually so tight. And this isn't a band that has just good stuff and nothing but that. It's great stuff and nothing but that. You know, even looking back to the Saw Blade EP, maybe it's not half bad, but in contrast to this other stuff, what can you even do? What can other bands even do? This band quitting is one of the most amazing statements ever. I support their decision entirely, because you know what? They're still making good music, just not as ISIS anymore. But shoot, I wish they'd go on tour. I would do anything to see them live. I think I'd sell my whole leg. Geez, for some vinyl? That's probably my next thing. You've heard me talk long enough. Good stuff. For real. Seriously. Indomitable discography. Please check out ISIS's discography. And, you know, that's about it. I'd appreciate it. Like and subscribe. Comments, questions, or concerns down below. Why are you watching this video? Do you like ISIS? Do you not like ISIS? And you're just wondering if someone likes them at all? Well, you can comment about that too. I would love to hear your thoughts and opinions on the stuff. Maybe there's a song that I think is ISIS's weakest, and you think it's their strongest. I'd love to hear about it. And also, down there, if you click the little Show More tab, you'll find my social media of my Instagram, Twitter, and most importantly, my Discord server, where we talk about lots of things. I've talked about most ISIS stuff on there, but I'll probably give it a little refresher now that I'm about to drop this video. But I'd love to have you guys there. You know, it's a great crowd. A little emotionally cathartic me finishing this series, you know, one of my first discographies in a long time, and it's of a band that is truly unstoppable. But you know, that's about it. It truly is about it. I hope you guys enjoy the music, because it is worth cherishing. Truly. Very philosophical, very amazing stuff. If I don't leave you anything but one thing, I want you to know ISIS has better things to say than me. I would rather you guys listen to ISIS than listen to me. Actually, maybe that's not necessarily true. Eventually I could make money off this if I'm really lucky. But second most important thing is ISIS. And that's me acknowledging my bias. But that's about it. Hope you guys have a good day. Bye.